healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape.
Welcome back to another episode of Coffee with Coker. On today's episode, it's a little bit of a different style, I guess. We have one of our frequent guests, Senior Vice President here, Aimee Greeter. She actually took on the role of hosting, and she's talking with a new guest, and her name is Frances Dare. And Frances is the America's practice lead for a firm called Hearsay Consulting. And they're an international firm that focuses on organizational effectiveness. And specifically, Frances and Aimee talk about healthcare M&A, which is a topic we frequently cover here on the podcast, but specifically improving the marriage post-transaction. And this is one of the things that Aimee spends a good bit of time working with clients on as far as beyond the deal solutions, meaning going beyond the actual transaction perspective and actually making sure that transaction works over a long period of time. And the reality is what we've seen is two things. One, the transaction itself is the easiest part of the whole thing, and that's only the first relatively small step, even though that can be very challenging in and of itself. And two, many of these deals we see, whether it's hospital transactions, whether it's hospitals buying up medical practices or medical group mergers or any other kind of deal, many of them just frankly aren't successful long term. And again, that's what Aimee and Frances dive into here. They talk about some of the statistics of post-transaction success, or I guess failure, that we've seen in recent years, specifically within the healthcare space. But more importantly, they dive into, okay, what are some of the things that organizations can, and leaders in those organizations involved in such deals, some of the things they can do proactively during the deal, before the deal closes, and then start planning kind of right away, diving in post-transaction to the different measures, different kind of key focus areas and key steps that they can take to making sure that deal is a success. And again, this is something we've talked a lot about. This is something we've worked with clients on. And frankly, I think we've continued to see deals, the volume of deals in the healthcare services space rise. But now I think the bigger challenge we're seeing with a lot of our clients is deals that they may have done a year ago, 3 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, still just aren't really coming together, or there's something missing, or perhaps in some cases, unfortunately, it's kind of a bust. So we got to find a solution for that. And so I think this is a great discussion, because this is something that's not going away. Just because you do the deal does not mean it's a success, and it's not going to just automatically fall into place necessarily. And so again, I think this is a very worthwhile discussion, a very important topic for our listeners and our clients to consider. And again, there's a lot more that we could cover here. There's a lot more that we could kind of go into greater detail and talk about, and I'm sure we will in the future. So we'd love to hear back as far as any questions you have. If there's anything that you'd like us to dive into in more detail, and then that would be very helpful feedback. So feel free to reach out to us. And as always, you can find this episode along with all of our Coffee with Coker episodes at coffeewithcoker.com. You can listen to them there, or all the standard kind of podcast formats and sources. So please feel free to visit coffeewithcoker.com. Also the Coker Group website at cokergroup.com. You can find all these episodes and more information on these topics. Thank you for listening, and enjoy this conversation with Frances and Aimee.
Thanks, Mark, for that great introduction. And Frances, I'll just echo Mark's comments of gratitude. Thanks for being here with us today. I know you are truly an expert and icon in the field, so I'm grateful to have your time and attention today, and your resources and knowledge to be able to share with our podcast viewers today. So thanks for being here.
It is my pleasure, Aimee. Thanks for having me join.
So let's jump in today, Frances. We've got probably more than you and I could ever talk about to fit into a podcast based on our experience. But the focus today is really on healthcare M&A. And when I think of M&A work, I always think of it as three steps. Number one is the pre-transaction strategy that goes into, where does a deal make sense? Why is a deal actually going to be viable, et cetera? And then I think about the negotiations and the pre-transaction due diligence. And then I think about the post-merger integration or post-transaction integration. And I think each of those has unique challenges and it has its unique fun aspects. But today we really want to focus on all three of those with potentially a little greater focus on that third bucket. What happens post-transaction? As I like to say, that's where the rubber meets the road. So tell me, Francis, a little bit about transactions within the healthcare industry, whether that's M&A, whether that's acquisitions. Tell me a little bit about what you're seeing.
It's an interesting time to think about the question, Aimee. I would say over the last 3 years or so, we've seen a more interesting mix of different kinds of transactions, if we want to call them that. Certainly, some of the more traditional, two entities come together in a merger are still part of what we're seeing. At the same time, I've seen, and I think you've probably seen as well, the last 3 years, especially more private equity interest in healthcare. And what I'm seeing is most of that's happening in the ambulatory space. Private equity firms are taking positions or actually acquiring innovators in primary care, urgent care, and occupational medicine. We've seen some transactions there, even some interesting investment in new methods of care, virtual and what we might call telemedicine or telecare. So some new players with more private equity happening. And we've certainly seen some very interesting partnerships, which we might not necessarily in the purest definitions of merger acquisition come into play, different kinds of business arrangements. And I think a lot of those have been around either connecting the continuum of care. To some extent, they've been around regional partnerships around the country. So lots of M&A and partnership activity in healthcare continuing, I think, and we'll see that going forward. And like we said, we've seen, partnerships or actual acquisitions with smaller regional hospitals joining larger regional systems. We've seen still some major systems coming together. We think Sanford Health and Unity Point is one of those. I think it's also really interesting that some potential mergers that were publicly announced then didn't actually follow through. I can think of one in particular with Baylor Scott and White Health here in Texas, or in North Texas, and the announced intended merger with Memorial Hermann in Houston, and then, a decision not to move forward with that. So to your point, Aimee, there's that pre-strategy part that's usually more with a smaller group of leaders thinking through what could or make sense and how to go about it. And as you said, in that negotiation and due diligence phase and post-transaction, then that tends to impact in some form or fashion the entire organization, right?
Absolutely. It's funny. I see so many of this similar attributes in the industry right now, Francis. So I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. I know you hail from the great state of Texas, but here in Charlotte, we had a potential transaction with Atrium Health, formerly Carolina's healthcare system, that hadn't gone through. And so you see all these inertia that comes into pre-transaction planning. And then for one reason or another, either it's not approved by the FTC, or there's differences in business opinions, or maybe there's some, worms that are underneath the rocks when you start doing the real due diligence, but definitely seeing some transactions happen, but others not coming to fruition. I agree with you too about private equity. We have seen so much of that recently. I was at a single specialty specific conference. It happened to be GI, but there were two different private equity firms that were represented at this conference out on the West Coast. And it was interesting. It seemed that every big GI group, that we'd ever worked with, or, the names that you recognize in the industry, were stopping by and having a conversation. And I think it's not necessarily that there's a genuine interest, but it's a thought that you have to see what's happening in that private equity space so that you're not left out. is that a viable option for some people, or is that seemingly going to be the only option as you look at market consolidation? And so I think some people don't even know what that is involving or what PE deals look like, but they feel like they have to have the discussion just because everyone else is having it. So I agree with you. Definitely seeing a lot of interest in that space right now.
Well, and there's a lot of money in the PE world deals. I was recently at a merger and acquisition conference with mostly private equity investors or people in the private equity investment ecosystem. And there's a lot of money looking for deals. And to your point, having a private equity firm either acquire you or take a significant investment stake in your organization, it's different implications from a business model perspective and from a financial performance perspective. In terms of the people of your organization and what it feels like to have this new kind of investor. That's a different kind of transaction than health systems coming together or a health system partnering with or acquiring medical practices with which they may already have some sort of working relationship. So, yeah, really interesting times. And Aimee, you triggered a couple of thoughts for me. One is that whether a transaction goes through or not, or goes part of the way, or gets announced and then doesn't happen, whatever the final decision or final instate is, there are really significant impacts on the organization, right? Any kind of potential transaction, the turbulent time, the people of the organization. That's one thought that triggered for me. And the other was this whole question of, are mergers and acquisitions successful? Some of these, potential transactions, we've both cited examples. The lead teams decide, nope, this probably isn't going to work. On the other hand, a lot of transactions go through, a lot of deals get made, a lot of mergers happen, acquisitions are done. And then there are real questions afterward about, is this accomplishing what we thought it would? And there's a widely cited Harvard Business Review article, and it dates back to 2011. It's not industry specific, but it gets cited a lot. And the number they put out there is that between 70 and 90% of all mergers and acquisitions fail. Now, you can talk about or argue about what fail means. But I think if we don't get too literal, we just take the point that a lot of what was desired from a merger, an acquisition, a partnership doesn't happen. And I think healthcare, is no different than other industry verticals in that regard. And has raised the question, what more could be done, or why do some of these transactions, these deals, these new entities fall a bit short in terms of what the original vision was?
Oh, I think you're exactly right. I think one of the statistics that's interesting to me about marriage is that we seem to be having a lower divorce rate. Between 2008 and 2016, a CDC report came out that divorces have decreased by 18%, at least in America. And everyone thinks that's great. But the reality is that the marriage rate is also declining. And so it may indicate that we're not really that much more happily married and having that many less divorces, but rather there's a fewer end of marriages to look at. And I think that's the question here is, are these transactions really that much more volatile than a typical marriage would be? Or is it just that we're culling out these transactions such that we're only getting to ones that are going to be successful? Or is the inverse true? Everyone's jumping to a transaction. And so the success rate or failure rate is exponentially higher because everyone's jumping into transactions. I don't know. It's sort of an interesting thought. Do you have any thoughts there?
Well, a number, and I love your metaphor. We could play with it for a minute. So if you think about your second phase in deal making, the negotiations due diligence phase, kind of the dating phase, right? If you think about the marriage metaphor, I've had the great opportunity and privilege over the last 3-4 years to be part of due diligence teams, working with some private equity clients in the healthcare space. And there are a number of things that typically go very well in terms of due diligence and looking at the deal and figuring out how things might or might not come together. But I've also seen there are some things that get less attention or are completely overlooked that I think would better inform the potential long-term success of the transaction. And of course, we all know when we have the wedding, it's loads of fun. We get to have a party and see friends and family and have a great celebration. And after that, there's a lot to do to nurture a marriage and make sure it thrives and continues to be really healthy over, decades. And similarly, using the same metaphor for our mergers and acquisitions scenario, it's great when the deal closes, and yet there is still a lot of work to be done for the new entity, whether it's somebody's been acquired or whether it's a true merger or whether it's simply a new business arrangement that's more of a partnership. There's a lot to do to ensure the long-term health and success of that. And some things get a lot of attention. And I think there's some things that get less attention that could help ensure the more successful marriage rate in our M&A world.
So I may be dating myself with this question, Francis, but if you get to be Dr. Roos, what do you say are the 2 or 3 most important things that help us end up on the success side of a transaction as opposed to that 70 to 90% failure rate? What would you say are the key considerations?
I think there's one overarching focus area and then some key considerations under that, Aimee. And I'd call the biggest thing that's overlooked or underappreciated is the human dimension of the organization. And while typically, almost always, there's a recognition that a potential acquisition, merger, partnership can bring on turbulent times, usually the response to that in terms of the people of the organization is communication, mostly from the top, often limited because of the nature of due diligence and the secrecy required. Even organizations that do that with intention and recognize that, the people of the organization are a key to all of this. What I really have never seen is what I call the emotions matter imperative. Said another way, people aren't robots and they feel things. And, when you get a group of bankers and private equity investors or financial people together to figure out during due diligence what the deal might look like, they aren't inclined to say rarely, wow, there's, we need to think about the emotions that the people involved in this transaction may be feeling. But it's absolutely essential. It's the foundation for leadership. It's the foundation for the new culture. It's absolutely at the heart of change, both during diligence and post-transaction. It seems so obvious. I ask people, okay, from the very minute there's even a rumor, a whisper in the wind about some sort of deal, merger, acquisition, partnership, doesn't really matter. What's the first emotion that sweeps through the organization? And people always know fear, right?
Absolutely, of course.
Right? It's just human nature, right? Oh my gosh, what does this mean? And people go to a fear place pretty naturally. And then the next emotions are, fear, anxiety, trust, paranoia, and with a sprinkling of hope, hopefully, right? But all those emotions, people are left to deal with on their own typically. They're often not recognized by the leadership team. There's no process for holding those or managing those. And I think that's an essential piece of what gets overlooked. And so that's the overarching thing, is that we need to know that the human part of all of what may unfold comes with the feelings and the emotions, the emotional content of that. And we can think about the whole organization, the people that work inside a health system, which is a very people-intensive business, probably one of the most people-intensive industries around. The other thing I would say, one of the sub-areas, is that the leadership team itself, both individual leaders and the leadership team, have their own emotions. And they may have more of a mix of hope and excitement, but at the same time, there's uncertainty for them. And so they've got, their own fear and anxiety mixed in. And some of that's conscious, some of it's unconscious. But how often do leaders get the ability to, the permission, so to speak, take the time to individually process what they're going through? And how often have we seen during the diligence phase leadership teams deliberately going through a process and dedicating time to knowing how they're going to take their organization through this emotionally turbulent time? I think it's very rare.
No, I completely agree with you. I consider myself somewhat of a John Cotter disciple. I think that he does great work. And I was looking at an organizational dynamics book that he wrote, I think in the late 70s the other day. I was just looking through it as I was doing some change management work. And I was thinking about, he lists sort of 5 key organizational processes: information gathering, communication, decision-making, matter or energy transporting, and matter/energy conversion. And then there are all of these elements, let's say, that impact those operational processes. And what's interesting to me is that when I think about every one of those processes, I put a person, either in charge of or directly affected by all of those. I mean, especially in healthcare, it's a people business. And so we think about, how do organizational dynamics impact individuals within an organization? But then what happens when you bring together separate organization processes and you're trying to blend those? Well, now you've got 2 sets of processes, you've got 2 sets of people, you've often got 2 sets of cultures. And how do you really address those, times 2 at that point? I think it's difficult enough to have a really strong organization. And then when you go through a massive change like a transaction brings, how do you ensure that everything is continuing to roll? I think you're exactly right. I think where most people go is with that fear, and then all the emotions that follow, like you said, anxiety and paranoia and mistrust and all those kinds of things. So I think it's absolutely incredibly important to think about the fact that people are people and not, like you said, just robots. So I absolutely agree with you. The people aspect is, I think, underappreciated in so many ways in terms of its impact, and underappreciated in terms of how impactful it can be in making a success or failure of an overall transaction.
Aimee, your points are so true. And if we carry that thought forward just a little bit, one of the challenging parts of due diligence is the secretive nature of it, right? It's done under very strict confidentiality agreements, and the ability to be completely transparent and open in terms of communication is limited. And so in the absence of information, people tend to think of the worst case scenario, right? They start to, come up with dramatic scenarios and confabulate. And so that emotional fear factor can become even worse if not attended to. And the other interesting kind of bind is one that there's a wonderful sociologist who's written about work and the people of work for her whole career, Arlie Hochschild. And in one of her books, she talks about the emotional pinch where people, especially in industries like healthcare, where we expect our workers to come to work and be happy and put on a happy face, and they're not allowed to feel frustration or, have any of their less positive emotions show. And so people may feel like during any kind of potential merger, acquisition, partnership, that they have to put their happy face on when they come to work, even though they're feeling all these emotions that we've talked about. And that can make the scenario even more of a challenge.
So, Frances, why does all of this matter? Why is this major emotional swing that people can feel and dredging up all these feelings, why does it actually matter to transactional work? I mean, couldn't you just be a cold robot of a manager and just say, don't worry about that. Don't think about that. Everything will be fine. Why should we care? What does that matter?
Lots of things evolve when people are in this emotional state. Lower productivity. It's just natural that with all this broiling and moving inside psychically that, we're less productive people. You start to also see the rise of more cliques or tribal behavior, people coming together and kind of, forming their own band, not always in a healthy way. Decreased loyalty, right? People start to question whether the organization's loyal to them, how far their loyalty to the organization extend, and that's where the risk of losing usually if you're high talent people are the people you really want to keep, who have options to go someplace else. And so you start to see a decrease, you see talent walking out the door, more passive aggressive behavior. And one of the ones I've seen in particular from organizations where I worked and we had potential new relationships under play or the potential of being acquired is that leaders mid-level and up start to become afraid to make decisions. They're not sure, where their authority extends. They don't want to take on more risk in terms of being able to stay with the organization long term. The strategic direction of the organization is less clear. And so people stop making decisions. But the business needs to continue, right? The work of the organization needs to go on. And so even for those really, hard-nosed business people who aren't into the feeling emotional side of the people they work with, there are very compelling business reasons to care about all the things we've been talking about and to do something to hold the emotions and lead the organization forward.
So, Frances, I have a question about psychological safety. So one of the things that I have heard is that organizations have to create a culture of psychological safety where it's okay to ask questions or it's okay to fail. Following up on your last point, do you think that pre-transaction due diligence creates inherently a lack of psychological safety, or do you think people bring that onto themselves as sort of a, self-preservation mode? Well, I can't do things that are risky because it could impact me.
I think it's some of both, honestly, Aimee, but I think that it's one of the areas overlooked in terms of a leadership team and how they guide their organizations through these turbulent times. I've rarely seen, and when I've seen it done, it's done very well. The leadership team say, we need to dedicate some time to figure out how we're going to handle the emotional part of this with our people. We need to, as a team, be able to give voice to our own hopes and fears, and we need to support each other. And even leadership teams as individuals saying, this may be a time where just, working with a coach of my own will be helpful. But I would say a couple of things in terms of best practices. First, recognize that any leadership team that's taken its organization through a potential merger or acquisition faces a challenge of keeping the business going and operating in its best performance, and also the time involved in going through a due diligence process, especially if there are multiple suitors. I talked about my experience doing this with private equity firms, and typically the organization that is potentially going to be acquired or in which there will be an investment stake is talking to multiple potential investors. And so that leadership team has huge demands on their time. And that's just important to acknowledge at the outset. I would add, it's still important to dedicate some time to what I just said. And I would say bring in a consultant or an external team, or at least take somebody from your organization that really knows how to do this and put them on point for facilitating leaders through, this part of the process that says, spend some time together. What are the hopes and fears for the organization in the new arrangement? Give name to our own emotions, and then talk about how to hold the emotions of the organization. And I can give examples of processes to do that and some examples from my client work in doing that. So that's the first part of the answer, Aimee, is I think leadership teams don't often know how to, and very rarely, dedicate the time and establish a process for establishing, as you said, that safe space for the people of their organization in terms of psychology and emotions. I would say just fundamentally the most powerful thing that can be done, and a leader at any level of the organization can be coached to do this, which is just giving the emotions a name takes so much of the energy out of them. Slightly different example, but perfectly relevant. I've often, and starting early in my career, taught our teams how to deal with unhappy customers, typically patients and their families. And the very first thing we teach them is to listen, right? Just listen actively. And then the first response is play back the emotion that you're seeing. Gee, Mrs. Jones, I can see how frustrated you were in that situation. I can feel how angry you are. And just the act of recognizing and naming that emotion can do so much to take the energy out of it. And then you can shift to problem solving in that customer service scenario. In the mergers and acquisition partnership scenario, just a manager saying to their team, I can tell everybody's feeling fear, you're anxious, I get it. I get it. And just that act can create some of that emotional safety that you're talking about and can decrease the level of fear and anxiety.
Thanks, Frances. I completely agree with all of your points. I think one of the things that many people struggle with, though, is how do I make this a success as opposed to a failure? What do I do? How do I motivate my people or communicate with them effectively? What do I actually need to do step by step to make a go of this? So can I continue to pick your brain on that? What and how do we really make this a success?
Aimee, your question is such a good one. So practically, what can we do from a process and from a communication and from a change leadership perspective with the entire organization, the people of the organization? None of this is super complicated, which is good news. So I've mentioned already just the ability to name emotions. So helping, coaching, teaching, expecting that managers at all levels do things like hold town halls. They'll have team meetings. They'll open up this conversation about, what is everybody feeling? And not just a touchy-feely kind of open conversation, but actually guide people through what are your hopes? There's a lot of good that can come from this. What are your fears? What's worth keeping from this organization? Culture, values, foundational stories from, when this organization came into being. What do we want to carry forward? But this is also our chance to let go of some of the things that no longer serve us or things that are less productive parts of our culture. So having those very open dialogues, having some structure around that, just asking those key questions. I add often that in addition to in-person or virtual town halls or team meetings, we can really take advantage of digital forums like chat rooms or discussion boards to give everybody in the organization a chance to be part of the conversation. And those often can provide a benefit in terms of being anonymous. So people who might be hesitant to speak up in the town hall or in a team meeting can come into a digital discussion board anonymously and, answer those questions, share what's on their mind. And those also have the ability to help the organization aggregate some of the themes and see what the conversations are. One of the more powerful client examples I like to share from our work is an effort similar to this, where through a combination of workshops with the top tier senior leaders And then through a combination of team town halls and meetings and chat forums, the entire organization was brought into conversation. Now, this was a global company and a mid-sized one, so possibly bigger than a large health system, but not necessarily, because as we know, some of the biggest health systems in the country have a very large workforce. But through this combination of channels, there were 23,000 different voices, so to speak, brought into both these formal and informal conversations. And what it allowed was the leadership team could see from across the whole organization what were the themes. And over time, what were the top concerns? What were the themes? How did things change over the progression of a pretty significant change initiative? And they were able to not only hear the voice of the organization, they were able to customize their communication back, right? And so we moved from hopes and dreams and fears into, as we got further into this change process, actually the design, so to speak, of the future state organization. Similarly with a merger or acquisition or partnership undertaking, as you get closer to having that deal come together, or for sure, once the deal has concluded, then you can use these same channels and these same processes to tap into the whole organization to say, what do we want this new organization to look like? What are the values? What's the best of both? You talked at the very beginning, Aimee, about you've got two organizations or you've got multiple different functions. How do we bring those together? And this is a way to do that, where you have the voice of all those stakeholders from across the organization contributing to what they would like the future to look like. And I'd add just that one of the other benefits of that is that you can shift from what the typical post-transaction mode is, which is top-down decisions, top-down communication, change leadership that's typically a lot of communication from the top and some training as new processes are put in place and new policies are put in place. But you can also allow, with this approach I've just discussed, allow people to figure out some of the new solutions at their level, where they know the work, where they know way more about how things get done than the executive leadership of the organization. And so it becomes much more of engagement across the levels of the organization and engaging people in ways that are empowering and moving away from kind of a from the top out model, if that makes sense.
It does totally. We have a hospital client who has recently introduced rounding into their processes. And so the leadership teams are responsible for doing rounds on specific units at specific days. And it has been, I think, very eye-opening to them to what you hear when you're actually rounding down on the floors and you're talking to staff nurses that are delivering care about things that you would never hear, behind the closed doors in the administrative wing. So it's things like that you allude to, Francis, of really allowing your people on the ground to be able to impact what the future is going to be. They're the people who often know it best at a micro level. And so as you think about building up as opposed to pushing down, it's critical that their voice be heard and be allowed to bubble up and formulate that new vision, that new culture. I completely agree.
I love that example. It's so true. I'm thinking about the days I made rounds with my teams inside a health system. And then if you think about even a good-sized regional system, and certainly our large national health systems, just from a practical perspective, the executive leadership team can't be out, making rounds with every unit on every floor in every facility. But now we have these amazing digital communication channels, right, which can allow everybody to have a voice, can collect information from all levels of the organization. And when not possible to be out in person at that level can give that voice of the heartbeat of the organization and the ideas around what the new organization, how it will actually work and get work done.
Mm-hmm. We have another client who used to have town halls with literally everyone. Over the course of a week, they'd have 8 or 10, and people would literally attend in person. And as the organization has grown, they just don't have the ability to do that. And so I think one of the things that has been eye-opening is how digital platforms are allowing those communications to take place, even as an organization scales to where in-person meetings aren't tenable. And that's not always to say that in-person meetings should be replaced, with more remote communications, but it's certainly a very good option to have that workplace or whatever technology systems that you have, Teams or whatever it is, to be able to have that robust communication. I think all communication is good communication, even if it's not in-person communication. So I think you're absolutely right. Being able to use the correct tools for the size of your organization and the culture of your organization is imperative.
Absolutely, Aimee. And it drives home the point that in healthcare, especially, again, we're unique in so many ways. People work different shifts. We have a lot of part-time people, and so that ability, it's the best of both, as you said. In person is very powerful, but complemented with these other channels. If you're really going to give everybody in the organization a voice, both real-time and asynchronous can be very powerful. And, nurses don't have time during their very busy shift. It's hard to get them just to, even set aside time to do the required training every year. So being able, when they're, not in the busyness of their day, and have a few minutes to think and contemplate, and then have a way to contribute is super important. And I think that's in particular unique to healthcare.
Agreed. So I know, Frances, that we've talked a lot about fear and other emotions, but I think that transactions also come with a lot of excitement. There's a lot of true opportunities that come when organizations come together. And I think in healthcare, one of the most exciting things about increasing transactional activity is that there are systems now that are really improving the care that they can provide to patients. And because healthcare is such a people-focused, people-driven industry, I think potentially more than any other industry, I see a lot of great attributes that come with transactional work in terms of being able to impact the people who are providing the care and who are receiving the care. So tell me, am I just looking at this with rose-colored glasses, or do you really believe that M&A can lead to a lot of successes and to a lot of excitement, as I do believe?
I absolutely believe that. And yes, we've talked a lot about anxiety and fear. The intention has been to say, let's also focus on people's hopes and their visions. And so let's focus on that piece as we round out our thoughts today. I agree, Aimee. There's so much going on in healthcare these days. People in healthcare, they could have chosen different professions, but they chose this one, because it's almost a calling for them. And I'm excited. The forces that are behind new partnerships and, again, mergers and acquisitions are things like connecting the continuum, creating new ways of delivering care, being more consumer-centric and engaging people. I think that's all fantastic. And so my vision, my belief, my hope is that healthcare can lead the way, and we can prove to other industries that rather than 70 to 90% of mergers and acquisitions failing, that 70 to 90% of mergers, acquisitions, partnerships, new business models in healthcare succeed. I think we have a tremendous opportunity to show how this can be done and for organizations to work together in new ways. And because this is a industry of people serving people, as you say, when we both recognize that change is turbulent for people, but it is a time when we can unlock their hopes, we can embrace their vision, we can empower people, that all of this tremendous activity in healthcare that's going to continue can have tremendous success. And as I've already said, we can show other industries how to succeed in ways that haven't been seen in the past.
Well, I appreciate that, Frances, and thank you so much for your time today. I know that we have been friends for a while now, but I certainly appreciate your highly trained professional opinion on all things people-centered, especially with respect to M&A, as we could talk about today. So thank you for your time and for being part of this, and I'm sure we'll loop you back in for further podcasts as we go. Thanks, Frances.
It's been my pleasure, Aimee. I appreciate very much that you're focused on this very important topic and all the work that Coker does to help their clients thrive in these, as we say, interesting times in healthcare. Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, and then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us in a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback, and we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.